Hey, Matt.
Hello, Rich Lowry. How you doing?
Good. This is Rich Lowry of National Review.
This is Matt Welch of Reason Magazine, which I'm holding up to the screen. Our latest issue.
See? I wish I didn't plan ahead for this.
What?
So I didn't know it's going to be such a self-promotional blogging head.
I'm doing unspeakable self-promotion that you can't see right now as we speak. We have so very, very, very much to disagree about, Rich, but I thought that might be good to start off this conversation by kind of picking your brain about the 2012 Republican presidential campaign, which, for my money, is considerably more interesting than usual. You wrote a column about it last week, I think, kind of sorting through how a lot of the big names have stayed on the sidelines and what that means. I guess what I want to start off by asking you, since you have much better insight into the Republican Party than I do, I think, is it true, really, that the Republicans historically have kind of anointed their man well in advance of the scrum of the primary season? And if that is true, and we're really kind of in this open battlefield, what does that say about where the Republicans are, or where America is, and whatnot?
Yeah, I think it's generally true. I think the axiom that captured it best was Bill Clinton, who says that Republicans like to fall in line, Democrats like to fall in love. And you saw that in the 2008 race perfectly, where the Democrats had a perfectly fine front runner in the form of Hillary Clinton, had a lot of establishment backing, a lot of money, and they fell in love with the other guy, Barack Obama. And the Republicans had a perfectly dreadful establishment frontrunner, utterly unsuited for the role of establishment frontrunner, who the grassroots didn't like either, and blew himself up the summer before the primaries over the issue of immigration, and basically had no campaign. He just had himself in the form of John McCain, and through happenstance and perhaps a bizarre migratory instinct, Republicans ended up nominating him anyway. So I do think it's true Republicans do tend to fall behind the next guy in line.
That was kind of interesting, if I could just jump in, because since
Sure.
I wrote a book about McCain, which I quoted you very favorably in, that was also kind of interesting. Even it felt to me that primary campaign, precisely because McCain, imploded to begin with, he never really felt like he had total establishment backing. There's always been an arm's length from McCain, not just of grassroots, although that's pretty significant, but he's never really been fully an establishment figure, at least in presidential politics, and that was new. It felt kind of new to me.
Felt new?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was. He wasn't really a maverick by our standards, but the establishment didn't like him either. So he was a man without a party and without a home, and he was really exposed during the campaign as someone who, despite his reputation for being quite sharp on policy, which was, I think, was false and was really earned by just being the anti-Bush guy for so long and getting a pass from the media for so long, he really knew nothing. He couldn't defend his health care plan because he basically knew very little about it. He had no idea what his economic views were, once you got beyond a few conservative cliches. So I find him a very admirable man in a lot of ways, but he was just a terrible candidate. But it is an indication, though, of the power of fear and primaries, that in this last period that I believe the National Journal ranked senators on the vote, he was the most conservative senator, supposedly, which I think is entirely an after effect of the scare he got from J.D. Hayward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In looking back at it, and I forget the exact numbers, but I at least constructed a narrative where McCain wouldn't have won the Republican nomination if it wasn't for the non-Republican vote. It's basically independents and self-identified Democrats who registered Republican for the purposes of voting for him in the primaries. He, I think, only won outright in the early contested primaries, which he ended up securing his nomination at. I think maybe only one of them did he win even a plurality among Republicans who identified themselves as Republicans, which is
it's really
bizarre.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
That must be the first time ever. You had a Republican nominee winning the nomination without winning conservatives, really, which is why there's one reason I am not willing to count Mitt Romney as dead, as some of my colleagues are, just because McCain shows if the competition isn't so hot and if the competition splits in just the right way,
Right.
you can sneak your way through.
Now, is Romney, does he have more, if there is an institutional candidate, who is vying, in your eyes, to be the one that the Republican establishment, such as it exists? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's kind of the story here. But who is vying for that, your next in line role?
Romney and Huntsman, and Pawlenty is trying to straddle it a little bit. He's basically running in the conservative primary, but hopes to have some crossover appeal. And another thing that's going on here, to the extent that there is a conservative establishment, it's as weak as it's ever been. And through the Tea Party and the grassroots and through new media, it's just easier to do an end run around it than it's ever been before.
Is that a healthy thing? I mean, I of course rub my hands at the thought of any political establishments in this country getting the end around. From your perspective, or for the perspective of someone who cares about the health of the Republican Party, whether that's you or not, is that a good thing that's happening?
I think it is a good thing, given if it's the right candidate exploiting it. And if you look at the bucket of conservative non-establishment candidates, the problem is you just wonder whether any of them could actually put it over the finish line in a general election. We'll see about Michelle Bachmann. I don't know a lot about her. I've not been around her, which is something I have to go really see her in Iowa and New Hampshire and get a better sense of her. But certainly the conventional wisdom is it would be hard for her to reach out to the middle. Herman Cain, who's creating a lot of excitement now, big, appealing personality. I've never seen a presidential candidate say he doesn't know the answer to so many questions as Herman Cain. And it's not just the flub on not knowing what the right of return is on that Chris Wallace interview, in the debate where he basically introduced himself to a lot of people and did himself a lot of good. He said he doesn't know what his view of the Afghan war is because he hasn't gotten high-level briefings yet, which is really rather extraordinary in the case of a war that's been going on for 10 years.
And at the same time, that might be part of the reason for his appeal, right? I mean, we are living in a season where there's widespread bipartisan dissatisfaction with each political party. The base of each party hates their party. I think the Republican base, or even the Tea Party base, which is still kind of standoffish to the Republican Party, or at least maintaining some independence here, they're open to having people who seem like unwashed or unprepared candidates. I mean, actually, Herman Cain is incredibly washed compared to I think Sharon Angle, for example, or the witch whose name I've forgotten now. But I mean, the Tea Party has shown that they're willing to back someone who seems, by some definition, not ready for prime time, as exactly a defense for why you should back them. Which kind of overlaps with Sarah Palin's purported candidacy too, because she taps into this sense of kind of cultural alienation from the political culture. What do you see about Palin right now?
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. It's almost as though being unprepared is a qualification. And what I would like to see, I think the sweet spot of these candidates, if we're going to talk about them in the context of the 2010 midterms, is a Marco Rubio, is a Pat Toomey, is a Ron Johnson, who really was discovered after he spoke at 2 Tea Party rallies and did a lot of talk radio with a guy out there named Charlie Sykes in Wisconsin, but is a really appealing candidate on his own terms. So those bucket of Tea Party candidates, I think, turned out much better than the Sharon Angle or the Christine O'Donnell. So, you want someone who's anti-establishment, who's fresh and who's new, but can also win at the end of the day. Palin, I don't know. My guess is that she's not running. This bus tour that she's been on is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen, where almost explicitly the purpose of it is to yank around the media.
Yeah.
And her fans just love that. because they can't stand the press, and they think, rightly, I believe that she in a lot of ways has been treated unfairly. So they don't just like her on her own in her own right. They like her because of the people who hate her.
This is maybe a slight detour, but it's something that I see in my kind of media stream, and I'm sure you do as well. There is a feeling out there, or kind of a meme on the chin-stroking left and in some journalism circles, that right now sort of Planet Conservative or Planet Republican is kind of in the grips of a mania. I mean, this is something that David Frum says. Andrew Sullivan says it from a slightly different direction. And, people like Jay Rosen will say the same thing. Basically, Republicans have gone crazy now. And Sarah Palin is an epiphenomenon of this kind of just culture war, Andrew Breitbart pugilism, and I say that as a good friend of Andrew's, and that sort of Republicans need to work through this if it's even possible. What's your kind of basic response to that critique, which I'm sure you get more than I do?
Well, there's no doubt that there is a premium within the movement on combativeness at the moment, and anti-Obama combativeness in particular. And you saw it in the reaction to Donald Trump, who has no conservative credentials whatsoever, but got some traction among conservatives just because he was out there wailing on President Obama every day. But I think it's possible to exaggerate the importance of this phenomenon. One, because it's really a characteristic of any party out of power. Howard Dean did not have his moment in the sun because it was, cool kind of chin-stroking analytical criticisms of George W. Bush in the war. It was because he was representing, the so-called Democratic wing of the Democratic Party and was hyper-partisan and, was hurling thunderbolts every day at the incumbent president. So some of this is inherent in American politics, and there's nothing wrong with it. Two, if it's really the case that this is the dominant consideration over every single other thing, well, then Sarah Palin would be the front runner for the Republican nomination, and you'd see her, 50% support in national polls. You don't. She polls 15 or 20%, pretty much where every other fairly well-known Republican is at the moment, which to me shows that people like her. Again, they can't stand her enemies, but they have some doubts whether she should be the presidential nominee because they wonder whether she could win, which is a rational calculation. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I do not see conservatives going off the cliff. Also, the expressions of this so-called mania, I think some people are firing much too widely on that front as well. The Ryan plan, which is bold, which probably is not good politics, but it's not crazy. It's a very a carefully delineated alternative vision for the future of the country, set forth by one of the most impressive policy minds in the party, and has been endorsed up and down by almost every Republican on Capitol Hill. Now, David Frum, I think, says this is part and parcel of the mania. But if that's crazy irrationality, it's impressive irrationality.
I think there's a lot of stuff to chew on there. I wanted to sort of back up your look at the Howard Dean phenomenon, because I think everyone in American politics has a super short-term memory. And you're right, there was the importance of combativeness as a basic approach in Democratic Party politics became supreme, I think, after the 2004 election. John Kerry was another kind of milquetoasty, please, I have my military credentials this time kind of candidate. And Howard Dean had all the enthusiasm, all the juice, just not all the votes. And he tapped into this latent anti-war / anti-Bush energy that was out there. And in the 2006 congressional elections, it was people who were going to fight. It was Jim Webb. It didn't matter what they had to say about abortion. Remember, there was a whole wing of, now Democrats are willing to have some people who are anti-abortion just as long as they really hate Bush and they're pugilistic on trade, and there's more than anything else they're going to fight. And we saw that after they retook the House in 2006. If you look at the language used back then by Nancy Pelosi, just about we are going to gum up the works of official Washington, we're going to stop Social Security dead in its tracks. I'm sure there's all kinds of Jared Loughner quality hate speech, or for that micro moment when everyone cared about political terminology. Certainly, Democrats were violating it back then, but it was important, and it was a very understandable one on some level. Like the people who Democrats kept proffering up seemed apologetic for who they were, and so they were able to tap into this enthusiasm, this anger, and this internet savviness, among many other things, because that became subsumed within the party in 2005. Howard Dean became the president, the chairman of the party, and that sucked in all these people, and it sucked them into Barack Obama that had transferred very neatly. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's a huge difference between, let's say, the Howard Dean / anti-war movement and the Tea Party movement right now, because the anti-war movement, which was big, I was at that, I was at those protests in New York in 2004. That was in the hundreds of thousands.
So was I. I marched in that anti-war parade.
I hope waving, Bush out of Nebraska sign.
I still have my little, it's beyond reach now, unfortunately, but I still have a little sticker I got from that parade that I brought out when we were having the Jared Loughner debate, and it was a Republican elephant with a big no in it, and also a swastika somewhere.
No Nazi elephants. I think we can all stand behind that. But the Tea Party movement, which is Republicanoid, I think is a fair assessment. At the same time, is much more conscious or deliberative, if we can ascribe a top-down intelligence on something that is the opposite of that. But about being independent, about saying to the Republican Party, look, if you don't nominate people who are in line with our values, we will nominate a crazy person and lose, and you've got to go figure that out. The anti-war / Dean movement in the Democratic Party didn't do that. They became subsumed within the machinery, and now, MoveOn.org is busy trying to get net neutrality pushed through, and there's no anti-war rallies when Barack Obama uses lesser pretenses to go to war in some cases than George W. Bush. So I think that has an interesting bearing on the 2012 election. Will the Tea Party maintain that kind of arm's length independence, or at least enough, so that their fundamental concerns, which I think can be accurately characterized as the growth of government and government spending and debt, more above everything else, and also anti-Obamacare, that those remain concerns, because ultimately the base of the Republican Party, or the Tea Party base, was angered not just by Obama but also by Bush and by the bailouts. It didn't really flower until afterwards because there was an opposition and whatever else. But there's a fundamental critique there, and it's one that's curious for you to address. That Republicans controlled Washington and spent like drunken sailors, and are seen in the eyes of many people to have sacrificed what were supposed to be traditional Republican values when they ran Washington. And there's a thirst there that if we don't, and I think I've got thirst and hunger already mixed up in my metaphor here, but that if there isn't a candidate that reflects that in some way, then they're not going to get out the Tea Party base.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Clearly, it's partly an anti-Bush phenomenon, and the way I look at it is the 2008 election was partly an accident of timing. If you'd had the real financial meltdown 2 months after the election, Democrats still would have won the election, I believe, but they wouldn't have had the kind of numbers they did. And what you saw was the leftmost Congress, we've had since probably the 1960s, coming into power at a time when conservative attitudes were on the ascendance on a whole bunch of things, according to Gallup. So you had this kind of disconnect, and I think part of the reason why was that Bush had kind of acted as a suppressant on a whole bunch of conservative attitudes, because he was so unpopular by the end. So you had this delta between where Congress was and where the public was, and then you also had this delta where the popularity of the Republican Party was still in the tank. If you look at Gallup Party ID numbers immediately after the election, at the same time you also had more people identifying themselves as conservatives. So that was another big delta, and the two of those, I think, combined created the conditions for the Tea Party.
And so what I'm wondering is, does this reflect kind of, I assumed after McCain lost that what we would see is a civil war for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. Haven't really seen it yet because people got focused on opposition or on individual issues. But I take the 2012 primary season as to be some kind of a proxy war for that. There are strains within the Republican Party which have been sort of disrespected. How to put this? For a long time, we lived in David Brooks's Republican Party. I think, especially after September 11th, when George W. Bush sort of, adopted a lot of McCain-esque approaches to foreign policy in particular, and other things. But we had a kind of big government conservatism that was sort of ahistorical in terms of emphasis, at least, from the Republican Party. That's kind of run its course. So there's questions about interventionism. How often do we do it? How much do we sort of play, rally around the flag, nationalism, a lot of sort of military martial rhetoric? How much do we emphasize the limited government thing? You see things like the rise of the Ron Paul kind of revolution as a counter weight to all of that. And where does this all mix out in the Republican Party? That's why I find these primaries so fascinating, because I don't think that those answers are settled right now at all.
And where I think the Civil War phrase is inapt, I think if there was a Civil War over domestic issues and size of government issues, that's over. The Tea Party won, almost without a fight. Where I think you will see much more interesting divisions and divergences among the candidates on policy. I think on domestic stuff they'll probably be all in the same place with a few different emphases here and there, is exactly on foreign policy. And you have Tim Pawlenty, who's staked out a very robust Bushian type position. He's in favor of the Libya war, only more so than what we're doing now. And you're going to see, Haley Barbour was the first guy with his sort of toe into this anti-interventionist pool, and of course ultimately he didn't jump in as a candidate. But Huntsman, I believe, opposes Libya. One thing I was struck by, I wasn't able to watch the first debate in its entirety because I missed it because we were on a National Review fundraising cruise, so business always comes first. But the parts of it I did catch on YouTube, I was struck by the fact that Ron Paul's foreign policy answers, which were the most reliable source of booze in all the debates in 2008, and the easiest thing to do to get a rise from an audience when you're any other of the presidential candidates in 2008 was to beat up on Ron Paul in foreign policy. I was struck by the things he said got applause.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether that was there were a lot of kids in the audience or what accounted for that, but to me that was very striking.
I think there's a couple of things. One is that, the moment that was supposed to end Ron Paul's career actually launched it, which is when Rudolph Giuliani went ballistic at him at, I think it was the South Carolina debate from basically 4 years prior to this one, where Paul gave basically a blowback answer to the causes of 9/11, and Giuliani demanded an apology or just went nuts, and everyone took turns beating up on Ron Paul, and most people said that's it, Ron Paul's dead, and in fact he was able to raise money off that. It really raised his profile, and I think it's not as if the Afghanistan war is getting any more popular or just U.S. military interventionism writ large. There's no sense, I don't think, right now among most human beings that there's a guiding intelligence sort of dictating where are we going to go with this thing, what's it going to look like 5 to 10 to 15 years from now, how do we choose when we're going to send troops in or enforce a no-fly zone next. And that's, you can suppress, it's one of the themes of the book that Nick Gillespie and I are coming out with next, or at the end of this month. You could suppress sizable trends or sizable constituencies within your party base for only so long in American politics anymore. if you consistently sort of flout or don't care about or even ridicule the concerns of people, they're going to work around you, just like consumers work around all kinds of restrictions by companies that don't treat them right. And I think you're going to see this, you'll continue to see this with the kind of Ron Paul crowd and, Tea Party keeping people's feet to the fire on domestic policy, but also there's an anti-war or, at least a no nation-building kind of sentiment within the Republican Party that did not get a lot of respect there for a number of years. And those people are mad.
Yeah, to put a finer point on it, it's not anti-war, it's anti-counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
And counterinsurgency was never a natural fit for conservative foreign policy because conservatives, to the extent they are interventionists, tend to be Jacksonian in their sentiments, which is just let's bomb the hell out of the bastards, kill them if we have to, and win and leave, basically. And that kind of sentiment, Bush played to it in a lot of respects because he is, the tough-talking Texas hombre. But what I would have thought would be the natural conservative discontent with counterinsurgency, which personally I don't share because I think it works and is a necessary tactic in these sort of wars. He really suppressed it, and I thought it would come out more in 2008. It really didn't because of the afterglow of Bush, and then you had the nominee as John McCain. Now it's that Bush kind of keeping the lid on that sentiment is that lid is totally off, and it'll be interesting to watch. Let me ask you, turn the tables here a little bit. So what's going on in the Gary Johnson, Ron Paul primary or competition for that libertarian slice of the Republican vote?
Well, as you and certainly most libertarians know, libertarians like nothing more than shooting each other in the face whenever humanly possible. And so there's a lot of people expending breath on, which one's it going to be? Do I like Gary Johnson? Do I like Ron Paul? Subjecting them in some ways to a get on or off the island test that, for instance, I don't think social conservatives are doing to whoever can be described as a social con of running for the presidential primaries and stuff. The way to look at it, I think, that's most useful is this. Ron Paul is engaged in a long-term educational project. He is not practical. He's practical about getting himself elected, and I think actually people underestimate that, as our senior editor Brian Doherty has pointed out recently in the magazine. He's one of the only, if not the only, person to win as a non-incumbent in Congress 3 different times, which is pretty impressive. So clearly he's doing something that resonates with his own voters, and he has some canny instincts as far as all that stuff is concerned. But he's operating on the level of principle. And we saw this actually at the GOP debate in South Carolina, which I greatly enjoyed, if nothing else, for its long discussion about legalizing heroin, which is something that I didn't expect to soon see at a Republican debate, let alone draw much of applause itself. And the two, libertarian-leaning guys there each had a really different answer about that same question. They're both in favor of repealing the drug war, identifying it as the disaster that it is. And I know that you guys, to maybe a different flavor or degree, more or less agree with that concept. But Gary Johnson gave the very kind of practical, hey, do a cost-benefit analysis. We're, locking up 2.3 million people in prison right now. Blah, blah, blah. It's the biggest source of state spending, the biggest growth item in state spending budgets on prison systems besides Medicare. This fails the cost-benefit analysis. And Ron Paul gives the answer of, hey, look, if we legalized heroin tomorrow, would you use it? And that is a way of making you think about the philosophy of it. And frankly, I'm someone who wants to legalize a hell of a lot of things out there, even though I haven't tried most hard drugs, certainly. But I always kind of get a little bit cautious about saying, yeah, legalize heroin, shoot it in the baby's eyeballs, all that kind of stuff. It's like, let's start with marijuana and kind of go from there. But he reminded me that, we have this weird sense in America that unless we expressly get the government to call something illegal, then we are implicitly endorsing it somehow. And he said, hey, if we legalize it tomorrow, would you do it? Would you do it? No, you wouldn't. So maybe we should look at this differently. So Ron Paul's engaged in this kind of educational, change the way you think about things, make you go, huh, in ways, make you think about the Federal Reserve, which no one cared about 4 years ago. And now, suddenly, his audit the Fed bills get a lot more traction, and people, Bernanke is forced to give press conferences, and this is because of Ron Paul. Johnson is giving the more kind of consequentialist, look, I was a pragmatic governor, I'm trying to get stuff done kind of approach. And I think, from my perspective, I just want there to be, in general, better people than bad people running for president. I'm happy to, if there's, 2 of the final 5 who are like that, or at least, a bunch of the finalists are people who sincerely and regardless of who's in power, believe in limited government, who get excited about the notion of shutting down entire federal agencies. That strain has kind of wilted in recent vintage in the Republican Party. They are 2 examples of people who believe in that stuff strongly. And I think, and this is me hoping as much as it is me thinking, that the Republican Party won't get a strong backing unless their candidate is someone who can talk very convincingly on that. And it's not about legalizing heroin. It's about cutting the size of government in a way that is robust and radical, which I think is right now more in tune with American concerns than it has been in a really, really long time. So I welcome them both. If someone held a gun to my head and forced me to choose between them, I would do incredible jujitsu and knock the gun out of their hands.
So, did I hear you saying Gary Johnson's the more practical
But I mean,
candidate?
Ron Paul will tell you that. But Ron Paul, we interviewed him a couple of weeks back, and like, oh, so are you going to release like a budget? And he's like, no. I mean, that's not his game. His game is to make you think about currency, about bubbles, about Austrian economics. I've been to a Students for Liberty, I think it was, meeting in which he talked, and he didn't go out there and say, go door to door and hand out Ron Paul signs. He said, what you really need to do is to perfect your philosophy. That's a weird thing for a politician to talk about. That's what he's interested in. So he himself will drop a lot of pragmatic discussions. I mean, how many votes has he been the only person voting no on, just so that he can sort of talk about it philosophically. And that is, I think, one of the big reasons for his attraction, and particularly among young people, and also some even disaffected Democrats, because principle is a wonderful place to live, right? It is totally theoretical on some level. It is moving. He can speak in a very moving way about the glories of freedom and constitutional limitations on government. It is fundamentally attractive, and there's a sense of idealism that coalesces around him that has in some ways less to do with him as a person or a candidate or someone with ideas, but more just he has a pretty radical and untethered to pragmatic politics notion about human liberty out there. So I think that's going to he's going to be a force. There's no way he's not one of the final 5, and I'm willing to bet you or anybody else at least $12 that's true. Because that organization, and we come in contact with it a lot here at Reason, all the various Paulite organizations, they're incredibly robust, rich, and passionate. I mean, he's going to pack every one of those debates with people who are going to be cheering wildly for closing down foreign bases and legalizing heroin, and it's going to make, I think, the Republican primary season much, much more interesting.
So it'll basically kind of be the CPAC strategy writ large?
Yeah. I mean, and as you pointed out earlier, and I think it's an interesting formulation, you don't have to get a majority this year. You have to navigate the ups and downs the best and be the one at the end of the day holding, the biggest bag. I'm not going to bet on any of this stuff. I think that people tend to be the easiest way to become silly is to make political predictions, especially on presidential campaigns. I was recently rereading a bunch of 1991 coverage of the Democratic primary season, and it was all, there's no good candidates out there. When's Mario Cuomo going to get in here once and for all and clean this up? The 7 dwarfs, blah, blah, blah. No one is serious. No one has any kind of political instinct. And it's like, you know what? Bill Clinton was one of those guys. And he turns out to have been a pretty, strong and interesting candidate.
Yeah, that's true. But what are the odds that one of these guys in this field is the best politician of his generation, the way Bill Clinton was? If they are, it has been well hidden to this point. And so I still tend to think it's a pretty weak field, certainly at the top, or what's considered to be the top, because Romney has this problem connecting with people. He has this authenticity problem where he's now addressing it by being unwilling to change anything, including the one thing that everyone in the party wants him to change is support for Romney Care. Pawlenty, you can make the case how it could come down to him on paper, but that's on paper, and his appeal isn't proven yet. And Huntsman just seems very unlikely to me. If Charlie Crist can be destroyed by hugging President Obama, it's going to be really tough to get the Republican nomination when you've served in his administration. And, those supposedly are the top three. And, that's why George Will basically says the Republican field comes down to one guy, Tim Pawlenty. Now, maybe that's not true, but if that is true, Tim Pawlenty is not a strong field. He may be a strong candidate, but that's not even proven yet.
Yeah, I mean, can you give us any insight on Tim Pawlenty? All I remember is that of going to the Republican convention, which he basically hosted in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he was one of those, hey, watch out. He's the one who's going to give us the speech like Barack Obama gave in 2004. He's the looker. He might have been the vice presidential pick. He was on the short list. In fact, I think he was most people thought it was going to be him. And so we were supposed to pay more attention to him and like Meg Whitman and a couple of other up-and-comers. And he and Meg just bombed, in my estimation. Just really boring, platitudinous speeches, the usual Reagan stuff, but like nothing really there particularly evident. Am I just being shallow again, hopefully?
Well, I think he's at his very worst when he's trying not to be boring.
I think you could put that on a poster. Yeah, that's really good.
His CPAC speeches were just last 2 years, I think, were quite bad. Where he's inveighing against brie eating and Chablis drinkers and talking about taking a page from Tiger Woods' ex-wife and taking a non-iron to the back window.
Does anyone even drink Chablis? Do they sell Chablis anymore? I'm not entirely sure.
I don't know, because for all my faults, I am not a Chablis drinker. I just want to get that on the record.
I had some rosé last night, Rich, so I'm happy to stick my neck out.
But when he tries to be kind of the mouse that roared, it's not true to him. And I think his play is be Tim Pawlenty, be a solid, earnest guy. Try to be creative and bold to the extent you can on the substance, and coming out against FL and Iowa is a pretty good example of that. And then let it come to you, and it's either going to come to you or it's not. And this is a little bit of the problem that Romney had in 08 and still has now, is just seeming so desperate, always seeming to reach for it rather than sitting back, be who you are, and let it
whoever that is
happen or not. Whoever that may be on any given day.
Yeah, I mean the Romney Care speech that he gave and his kind of ongoing defense of that really reminded me a lot of McCain and immigration 4 years previous. At the time, I was supposed to be finishing my manuscript on him, is right when McCain's whole campaign imploded and he fired 2/3 of the staff. It was like my due date was more or less right then, which was a very awkward, at least for me, getting off the country. But it was so clearly like this was an issue that maybe not a majority of even Republicans in America like cared about to a strong degree right at that moment, but it was still burned hot enough that in the context of a primary election, there was like no way that he could get out from under it. And he tried, actually. Back then, he completely got off of his legislation. He sent poor John Kyle to go and argue for it on the Senate floor and to be the kind of the manager of it, to take one for the team. But he got creamed on that. And this issue, I think, is more fundamental to the 2012 election by far. And I just don't see how you overcome that. I guess the strategy is that he wants to show that he's his own man and he's not going to budge, and that if he gets it over now, then people won't be asking about it anymore. But I mean, do you get any sense that you can survive such a thing in the current climate?
You can, if circling back to the beginning of our conversation, if no one else takes off and the field breaks in just the right way. But Romney's attitude clearly is like, the Courtney Love lived through this. He's just going to have to own it and hope it's not fatal and no one else works out. And of course he's partly the victim of a shift in thinking on healthcare on the right, because there was a time, and a number of liberal analysts have pointed this out, where the individual mandate was respectable on the right. The Heritage Foundation, for goodness sakes, was in favor of the thing.
We published a piece called, I think, Mandatory Health Insurance Now, a thought balloon, I believe, about in 2005, and I used to, hey, they do it for driver's licenses, why not healthcare? It seemed like a wonky way out of a difficult problem, but that's not really working out.
Yeah, and conservatives just moved away from that. The Heritage Foundation isn't in favor of it anymore, and here's poor Romney left, stranded, trying to defend that flag, as the last man standing.
So, what about the kind of feeling that a lot of people who are more libertarian necessarily than conservative, but who still identify more strongly, if they had to choose, with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party? Those people will say, a lot of those people who are our readers in many cases, there's no reason to trust Republicans. They have, they relearned the concept of that big government is bad on January 21st, 2009. What do you tell those people? Are they right?
Yeah, never trust politicians. I don't even know why they're asking that question. Of course you can't trust them.
That's true. Most of them have already moved on. They've answered the question, and that's it.
Bill Rusher, our late, great publisher, just always says politicians will always let you down. And it's always true. So you're just going to constantly have to stay engaged and keep their feet to the fire. But, my case comes down to a very pragmatic one. What's the alternative? Well, we've seen the alternative over the last 2 or 3 years, and whatever the inadequacies of the Republican Party on size of government issues during the Bush administration, this has been several magnitudes worse. So given the alternatives, I don't think there really is one to the Republican Party.
You talked earlier about how the Tea Party won the domestic argument, even though it's still, June of 2011 here. There's big dust up recently where Newt Gingrich poured gasoline on his head and lit himself on fire by calling out Paul Ryan's plan, and he basically lost. He was forced to crawl on his hands and knees and apologize and everything. Is that an accurate bellwether of where we're going, do you think, or where the argument is going to be? Or conversely, does the New York 26 congressional race and other kind of indicators suggest that we might have seen the high watermark or high Paul Ryanism, and now it's going to be kind of cautiously getting back to the place where we were, even 6 months ago, where the vast majority of Republican office holders distanced themselves from Ryan's original roadmap to balancing the budget in 2063? I
think it's too late. They've burned their ships behind them, and they really have no alternative. When the House took that vote, and I was, I probably would have done it differently. But when they took that vote, I thought, okay, they're going to get their legs cut out from them by the Senate, and the presidential candidates will establish as much distance as they can. And it's going to be tough for these guys to go back to their districts and defend this vote, but it's not going anywhere. And it's a year and 8 months to the election or whatever it is, so there's plenty of time. Not going to be a problem. But as it turns out, the Senate, most of it, Republican caucus swung behind it, because they, I think partly because of the reaction to the Gingrich comments, the party ended up being much more wedded to the Ryan plan than I initially would have expected. And you see some of the presidential candidates maintaining some plausible deniability, if you will, in Tim Pawlenty and Mitt Romney. But you see a guy like Huntsman, who's supposed to be the moderate in the race, saying this is the way to go, and I'm four square behind Paul Ryan. You have Rick Santorum saying the same thing. So you basically have, it's now a unified Republican position that we should move to premium support and Medicare 10 years from now. And politically, I'm not sure it's prudent, because they've basically taken the debate from debt, taxes, jobs, Obamacare to Medicare, which is just much tougher territory. And territory where I think they're inherently going to play defense. But just, sorry, one last thought. I can't see them winning the Medicare debate. I can see them muddying it enough that it doesn't really hurt next year. And I think ultimately determinative of what happens in next year's election is the economy. And if it's poor enough, Obama loses, and you have a Republican Party that's going to have a kind of quasi-mandate to do something on Medicare because they proposed this far-reaching, bold plan and survived it. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think that's a possibility.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I was just going to interject on the Medicare thing. It's sort of bold and scary politically, but it's also kind of the biggest problem in terms of looking at entitlement stretching out in the future and how we're going to pay for them. And I think that there is an appetite. This is something that Rand Paul says. We've interviewed a couple of times, and I find him to be a very interesting character. That he thinks that there is a politics for that right now, of walking around and saying, we can't afford Medicare. We are facing a Greece-like situation, which we have no idea how to process because none of us have really lived through it before. That there is a hunger, and Paul Ryan will say the same thing. There's a hunger for having a capital S, capital D serious discussion about these issues, and so maybe there is some political benefit out there. But I think you're also you're right about the short-term political peril of it. Peter Suderman, who writes great stuff for us on healthcare, had a good post on precisely this topic. I think it was in the wake of the New York 26, and he was talking about that vote that you were talking about earlier in the House. And his point, and I think it's a good one, is Democrats spent years and years paving the way on every level for what became Obamacare at the end. Yeah. I mean, there were think tanks that were just like churning away at this stuff. They were operating on so many different levels. They had pretty good tactical game plan, regardless of what you think about it on a personal level, but of sucking people into thinking about the public option and then just taking that away at the last minute so that you could kneecap your criticism without, or your the base without having to suffer from it. A bunch of different things. They laid the groundwork. Republicans just did an impulsive vote.
Yeah,
and
that's really true.
And when you do an impulsive vote, people can campaign against you based on that, and that's the great, a great side debate going forward in 2012 is, how will Americans react to that? I mean, we just got into the polling business, which is really fun because we get to ask questions in a slightly different way, I think, than other people, mostly about
them. The wrong answer. You're supposed to say we don't care about the polls.
We don't care about the polls, and we do care about the polls. We want to see if the country's attitudes are shifting in a way that we like or that we don't. And it's all very interesting to see what's going out there. And surprisingly, people don't really ask the kinds of questions that we're interested in. Bizarre, I know. Anyways, there is quite clearly reflected a strong sense that the debt and deficit are huge problems, and that by far the most popular way of dealing with it is cutting spending and not taxes by a ratio of 3 to 1. We gave them a series of different things to walk through on ways, balances that people could take. So it seems to me that there's a politics out there for that. I mean, since basically Bush came through with TARP and that first House vote, which I think was a real turning point, where the House, mostly Republicans, kind of rebelled against TARP and were branded as nihilists by David Brooks and a bunch of other official Washington type of people. Since that moment, there has been a populist anger at kind of bipartisan bailout economics, which has certainly gotten worse under Obama, and that anger's got to go somewhere. It's been pretty consistent. There have been very few of these interventions that have been popular. Obamacare has never been popular itself. So I gotta hope or think that there is a politics there that people can take, and most likely, since it's coming from me, that's going to be totally naive and out of touch. But I might also add, we don't know what we're going to be as a country 12 months from now. I mean, if international, the sentiment of international bondholders changes dramatically, all bets are off in terms of what politics and what economics looks like in this country.
Yeah. Well, the chances are, at least the chances of the Medicare program catching on are much better than legalizing heroin in the short term. we can say that. But I agree with Peter's analysis, and if I could have crafted this whole thing, I wouldn't have marched all the guys in the House through that vote, because I hate to say it, but Jane Corwin up in New York 26 is much closer to the congressional mean than Paul Ryan is. So the fact that Paul Ryan can defend it in a persuasive and impressive way does not mean that the other 200-something Republicans are going to be able to do it as well. And then I would prefer to see a presidential candidate, maybe Paul Ryan himself, take it up and give the party some air cover. But look, at the end of the day, something like this needs to happen. Medicare is a huge driver of the debt, and is also a huge driver of dysfunction in the healthcare market, and a huge driver of inflation of healthcare costs. So at the end of the day, it is the right thing to do. I'm just nervous about the reaction. And in politics, obviously, a big element of it is principle. Another big element of it is prudence. When is the right time to move and how. So it remains to be seen how the Medicare vote is going to turn out on that prudence front.
Two-part question. One, you think Paul Ryan's going to run? And two, can he then count on the National Review endorsement?
I don't think he's going to run. I'm not sure anyone's going to get in. Even Rick Perry. Maybe Rick Perry would be the likeliest of those three that people talk about: Christie, Ryan, Perry. Christie I just can't see, because I think as soon as he gives the slightest indication that he's interested, he plummets 15 points in New Jersey. New Jersey ice will just feel so ill-used, and he'll hurt all the Republican legislative candidates, and his career in New Jersey will effectively be over. So that would just be an enormous risk. Ryan, he's kind of left the door cracked slightly, but I just know from talking to Ryan World that very little, basically no thought has been put into it, and he has such a good perch in the national debate now, and he can wait in theory. Although you can also say maybe this is his moment and he should just grab it the way Obama did. But I think at the end of the day he won't do it. Perry, I don't have as much insight into, but Texas governor in his third term, he can raise a heck of a lot of money down there. He's got a message that's going to appeal to Tea Party types if he runs. He's got quite a good economic story to tell. So of the three, he would seem the likeliest to me. But then, of course, he has the huge albatross around his neck of being another Texas governor when Bush did not leave us with a great taste in our mouths for most of the public.
Veronique Derucci, who blogs for you guys and writes a column for us, great economist, she did a column for us maybe a year ago or so, talking about, I believe it was just like government spending or government regulation. Could have been both for all I know. I think it was spending. And she looked at all presidencies since post-World War II and who jacked it up the most. And her conclusion, her very scientific conclusion, was never elect anyone from Texas. It's just not going to work out for him. Waning moments here, since I unfortunately I have to leave a little bit early here. You're editor of a magazine called National Review. Tell us something that you're excited about that you guys are about ready to foist upon the world, besides another terrible cruise. Did you guys do Alaska? No, you went to the Caribbean, right, or somewhere like that?
No, well, we do two cruises a year now. So we did the Seine. I hate to say it.
You did drink Chablis, my God.
And then we're doing the Caribbean in the fall. But we have actually a fascinating piece in our next issue that we'll end up posting online that I think will generate some interesting discussion on age segregation and what our society loses by the increasing separation of people by age and the fact that you can be, young, footloose in your 20s and really never encounter anyone with gray hair if you don't want to. And it's a fascinating piece of sociology by one of our very young writers.
That's very interesting.
What's coming up in Reason 3D covers?
No 3D covers. We have a special issue, which I'm holding up to the camera right now, called Criminal Injustice. It's a brilliant headline. Inside America's National Disgrace. It's a special issue that kind of collects what we've been burrowing away at. Our Radley Palco, who since moved on to the Huffington Post, and Jacob Solom especially have been writing about all of the excesses and kind of shreddings of the Fourth Amendment that have come with the drug war and just our crackdown on crime for the last 3 or 4 decades. And it's just crammed with horror. But there's some silver lining in there. Among that is that, as you well know, there's been more movement on the conservative side, Republican side, than we have been able to imagine for a long time, of people saying, hey, we need to reform the criminal justice system. This is not working as cost-benefit. It's not working as a theory or anything else. And so we've started to see some reform in places like Texas and Dallas and in the state of Florida and elsewhere. But it's a real kind of damning summation of where we've allowed ourselves to go, thinking that the ends were justifying the means, and it turns out it doesn't all work out that way.
So I know you have to run, but Texas and Florida, is that drug court kind of stuff?
It's as much to do with the local prosecutors saying, hey, let's start up a DNA kind of innocence clearinghouse, actually caring about whether they have evidence sitting around that could exonerate people. In Florida, it was more like juvenile supervision stuff, just like kind of sensible outsourcing reforms so that we're not automatically institutionalizing every 14-year-old parts or whatever. And there's just been more, and Ed Meese, of all people, who I don't like on this planet, is now, along I think with Heritage, starting up a whole criminal justice reform movement or organization out there. So there is some interesting movement. Some of it's drug reform related, some of it's just kind of prison incarceration related, and maybe we should think about unwinding some of the 3 strikes laws and things out there. And I think it's an interesting, as a concept, and even a political concept, it's pretty interesting because it kind of cuts across both parties in ways that make the official parties kind of uncomfortable. But there's an opening there for people who care about this stuff to change by banding together in weird coalitions. But check it out. Newsstands near you.
All right, Matt. Well, very nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you, Rich, and thanks very much.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.